Hello, John Perry here. Welcome to my second ever podcasty interview type video. That's currently what I'm calling these. I should probably come up with a better name, but I guess that's good enough for now. Today my guest is Perry Marshall, who just happens to be my arch nemesis. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but Perry Marshall and I certainly have clashed in the past. Perry Marshall is an engineer and a businessman. A few years back, he decided to take his engineering expertise and use it to interpret evolutionary biology. He wrote a book about it called Evolution 2.0, which actually has some pretty interesting parts in it, but sadly, it's peppered with what I would call, creationist flavorings. He is certainly not a creationist in the traditional sense, and he's definitely not a Ken Ham type. You'll hear right away when you hear him talk, he's a very brilliant guy. But his book's creationist overtones caused him and I to fight a little bit on the internet. We got into some Twitter wars and so on. Today, however, we will not be fighting each other. We are putting aside our differences for the moment to team up to fight our common enemy. Think of it as, Thor and Loki joining forces to fight Thanos. But hopefully our story will end a little nicer. So who is our common enemy? Our common enemy is really everyone that doesn't understand what the term information means, but still insists on using their misguided concepts of information to argue either for or against evolution. I am talking about the ridiculous arguments made by creationists, such as mutations can never produce new information, or the equally ignorant arguments sometimes made by atheists, such as the genetic code isn't really a code, it's just sort of like a code. Both of those arguments are completely unfounded, and today, Perry Marshall and I will explain why. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Perry Marshall about genetic information. One more thing before I get started. I would just like to apologize for the fact that my last name is his first name. That is a little bit confusing if you happen to be just meeting the two of us here on this podcast, but we were born that way, so deal with it. My guest today is Perry Marshall. He is an engineer and an author. How long ago did we meet, Perry?
Probably 2 or 3 years ago.
You published your book in
2015. It was right around the beginning of the book coming out, somewhere in there. So, 2.5 years, let's say.
Perry Marshall wrote a book called Evolution 2.0, and I believe it was, the way I was introduced to you is your secretary sent me a copy of the book in digital form, asking me to review it. And I did, and I reviewed it negatively. Perry and I disagree on a lot of things, and today we're going to talk about things we don't disagree on. We're going to be talking about genetics and the genetic code, what the heck the genetic code is, and you might be wondering why I'm not asking a biologist about this or a geneticist about this. I've actually found, Perry Marshall and I started off kind of, I guess, in a Twitter fight, right? Going back and forth. But we ended up taking it to, emails back and forth and then phone conversations. And we've become friends over the course of these arguments we've had. I've come to realize that Perry is probably the best at describing from an engineer's perspective what the genetic code is. He's really been able to simplify for me in our conversations what is a coding language and why is it that the genetic code matches coding languages perfectly. When we say that the genetic code is a code, that's not an analogy. The genetic code really is a code. And geneticists understand this. Watson and Crick understood this. But a lot of people don't understand this today. And I've found that the way that Perry is able to articulate this is probably the best that I've seen. So even though we do disagree on many things, we definitely agree on this, and I'm really happy to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. And one of the things I like about what you're doing is if somebody brings a useful view, then let's have the conversation, and it's not all this territorial stuff, which is all too common in the evolution conversation. So let's mix it up. Let's talk about this, because this is a super central issue to the whole, not only to evolution, but also to origin of life. I think also to artificial intelligence. And so, there's a lot to dig in.
Now, at this point, our viewers are probably just itching to know what it is that you and I argue about. So maybe we should give them a little tease about that before moving on. There were a lot of good parts in your book, which is why I gave it 2 out of 5 stars, but I docked you 3 stars because of the book's main argument. Essentially, you say that the genetic code really is a code, and by the way, I totally agree with you on that, but then you go on to claim that only intelligent minds can invent codes, and I certainly do not agree with you on that. From there, you conclude that the genetic code must have been invented by an intelligent mind. Now, I know that that is an oversimplification of your argument, but is that a fair oversimplification of your argument?
It's fair. It is a little oversimplified because I'm completely open to a chemical or algorithmic or a physical law that explains where codes come from.
Right.
But so far, nobody's figured that out. And so this is why we have a $5 million technology prize. And I'm not sure that was really where the disagreement was. I think it was probably more like you're a lot more confident in the current, like the RNA world hypothesis and stuff like that, where I think the answer is probably going to come from a completely different direction if this is able to be solved. So probably most of our disagreements have actually been more along the lines of what can a replicator do and stuff like that. But one thing that's for sure is I think we have a pretty similar understanding of what codes and coding systems are, that the information problem in biology hasn't really been solved for origin of life, and it's a worthwhile problem. I'm pretty sure we agree about that. So.
Yes, yeah, we do. Let's talk about what is information, because this is the part where I really appreciate your work, is being able to really clearly define what information is. And I sent you this email with kind of the 4 different types of information that people typically talk about. One of the problems with this discussion of information is that people are usually talking about different things, so they talk past each other.
Yeah.
And so I got these 4 types of information. There's physical information, there's coded information, there's epigenetics. These are the types of information we find in life. There's epigenetics, and then there is information transferred between organisms through different signals.
To restate exactly what you said using slightly different words, there's physical properties, there's code, there's intracellular, and there's intercellular information. Is that a fair?
Yeah.
Right? So there's physical information like how big is the rock, how heavy is the rock, how much inertia does the rock have, what color is it, like all these kinds of things. And these things are certainly information in the common vernacular. They are not coded information in the specific engineering sense.
Right.
When I have a rock right over here. So, it's dark gray and it's got these minerals and it's got a certain weight and all this kind of stuff. And so those are all properties, but the rock does not contain any language with respect to itself.
Right. The only information transfer you can have between with physical information is when they connect. So if you get hit by a bus, information about its mass and density is going to be transferred into your body. And I guess someone who's really good at reading that could figure out what hit you.
Right.
We do this we look at craters and we can tell how big the space rock was that caused them. So physical information is transferred when things connect, or, light can be emitted off of a physical object and then hit our eye. And that's physical information. And that's what physicists study. It's not super important for when we're talking about the genetic code. That's right. A different type of information, coded information.
That's right. So then you have code. And so I'm going to define code as, let's say, symbols passed from an encoder to a decoder. All right. And so this gets to Claude Shannon's information model, where you have an encoder, you have a message, and you have a decoder, and the information goes from here to here. And this is me and you sending text messages. This is me and you sending emails. This is ASCII. This is HTML. It could be barcode, zip code, English, Chinese, anything like that. Really, you have layers of information because something is coming in here into the encoder, and then it's being translated to something, and then it's been being decoded, and then it's coming out. And then there is a correspondence where what comes out has a proper relationship between what came in, and you can determine whether an error has occurred or not. Right? So it's your daughter watching her iPad, through the Wi-Fi, or you're driving in the car, and, if the cell signal drops, it's because some error happened, it couldn't recover from it. And so an intrinsic idea of symbolic information is that a translation has occurred and the transmission has occurred, and you can determine whether it happened correctly or not. Right. So this is the basis of all digital communication.
For people hearing this for the first time, it might be really, really abstract and really weird. The purpose of coding information is to transmit it somewhere so it can be decoded later. And so when I'm speaking, I have an idea in my head, and I say, Perry, want to do a podcast later? What I'm doing is I'm converting this idea in my head to vibrations of my mouth, which go through the air. And in this case, they're also going through wires and stuff, but forget all that. Going through the air to your ear, and your ear is set up already to take those vibrations, and your brain is set up already to understand what those vibrations mean. And so the encoder and the decoder have to be set up in advance to understand what the message is in order for communication to happen. There must be a language or a code that both the encoder and the decoder agree upon, you could say. In your book, you use the example of a keyboard. When you press the letter A gets converted by your keyboard into zeros and ones, transmitted through a wire to the computer. The computer takes that and turns that into an A on your computer screen. So you got an encoder. The encoder would be the keyboard, right? And the language here would be zeros and ones, binary code. And yes, the decoder would be the computer screen, or the computer itself.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so you press A on your keyboard, right? And a 1000001 goes through a wire, because that's the ASCII symbol for A. And then, yes, an A, little pixels that look like an A appear on your screen. And you go, okay, so I pressed the letter A and an A appeared, so it was encoded and decoded correctly. Right. And that is, as simple as that is like, if you can understand that, then you understand the foundation of all digital communication, because that is how it works.
Right.
That's right.
Right. And that's also how verbal communication works, but we're using sequences of words or sound vibrations instead of sequences of zeros and ones, but the principles here are exactly the same. Now, just a quick note to our viewers. Hopefully Perry and I have done a good job explaining what coded information is, but in case it's still a little bit confusing, I have a diagram here that I'm showing on screen that will hopefully clarify everything for you, so take a close look if you need it. On the top row, we see a simple concept of a communication system. A communication system consists of an encoder, a message that can be transmitted, a decoder that receives the transmission and decodes it. In the second row, I have a real-life example. A keyboard is an encoder. When the letter A is pressed, it's encoded into a message of zeros and ones, transmitted through a wire to a computer, where it's decoded back into the letter A, which is then displayed on the screen. True communication only happens when a language is set up ahead of time, a language that both the encoder and the decoder, quote, know. In this case, that language is binary code. In row 3, I have a human example. We have a person as the encoder. He wants a house. He encodes his desired house into a message, in this case, a blueprint. The blueprint allows him to transmit that message to a decoder, in this case, a contractor. The contractor decodes that message into a house. What I'm going to do now is show you a 5-minute animation about how DNA works, and it's a video that I made for my other channel, Stated Clearly. If you're listening to this as a podcast instead of watching it as a video, that's probably okay, but actually watching at least this part for the next 5 minutes would be ideal. Either way though, as the animation plays out, see if you can figure out which part of the genetic system acts as the encoder, which part is the message, which part is the decoder, and which part is the decoded message. Just hit play here. Stated Clearly presents, what is DNA and how does it work? DNA, also known as deoxyribonucleic acid, is a molecule. It's a bunch of atoms stuck together. In the case of DNA, these atoms combine to form the shape of a long, spiraling ladder, sort of like this one here. If you ever studied biology or saw the movie Jurassic Park, you probably heard that DNA acts as a blueprint or a recipe for a living thing. But how? How on earth can a mere molecule act as a blueprint for something as complex and wonderful as a tree, a dog, or a dinosaur? To help answer that question, let's first take a quick look at amino acids. Amino acids are tiny little chemicals inside our bodies that are so important, they're often referred to as the building blocks of life. There's about 20 different kinds, each with their own unique shape. The neat thing about them is they can be attached to each other kind of like Legos to produce an endless variety of larger particles known as proteins. Amino acids make up proteins. Proteins, along with other chemicals, combine to form living cells. Cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. And organs, when they're all put together and functioning, of course, combine to form living creatures like you and me. These proteins that make up our bodies, and keep in mind there's millions of different kinds of proteins, they each have to be formed in the perfect shape in order to function. If they're the wrong shape, they usually won't work. That's where DNA comes in. DNA does a lot of interesting things, some of which we don't fully understand, but one of its main and most well understood functions is to tell amino acids how to line up and form themselves into the perfect protein shapes. In theory, if the right proteins are built at the right time and in the right place, everything else from cells to organs to entire creatures will come out just fine. This here is a simplified model of DNA. It shows us that the steps of the ladder are made up of 4 different kinds of chemicals shown here by different colors and letters. If you look at just one half of the molecule, you can read its chemical sequence or genetic code from top to bottom, sort of like a book. A single strand of DNA is extremely long, millions of letters long. It spends most of its life coiled up like a noodle, living inside the nucleus or the centerpiece of a cell. Amino acids, however, live outside the nucleus in what's called the cytoplasm. To help DNA interact with the cytoplasm and convert those amino acids into proteins, special chemicals inside the nucleus make partial copies of the DNA code. These partial copies, called RNA, look a lot like DNA, but they're shorter, of course, and they're missing one of their sides. Their small shape and size allows them to fit through tiny pores in the nucleus, out to the cytoplasm, and into the mouth of another particle called a ribosome. Ribosomes are protein-building machines. They read the RNA code 3 letters at a time, suck amino acids out of their surroundings, and stick them together in a chain according to the RNA code. As the chain grows, it bends, it folds, and it sticks to itself to form a perfectly shaped protein. Every 3 letters of the RNA code tell the ribosome which of the 20 different kinds of amino acids should be added next. For example, CAA tells the ribosome to grab a glutamine. AGU tells it to grab a serine, and so on. Once a protein is built, it can then go on to do a number of different things, one of which could be to help form a brand new cell. So to answer the original question, what is DNA? DNA is a molecular blueprint for a living thing. How does it work? DNA creates RNA, RNA creates protein, proteins go on to form life. This entire process, as complicated, as sophisticated, as magical as it might seem, is entirely based in chemistry. It can be studied, it can be understood. I'm John Perry, and that's DNA stated clearly. Okay, that was the animation. Now, hopefully, it was clear to everyone that the DNA, or I suppose you could say the entire nucleus, could be thought of as the encoder. The RNA is the message which is transmitted out to the ribosome. The ribosome is the decoder, and the decoded message is a protein. Throughout this process, the genetic code is the language that the message was written in. Any mutation in the DNA would modify the message that is transcribed into RNA and would then modify the type of protein that is built.
That's right. That's right. So you have a strand of DNA, and then we're going to messenger RNA, and then so that's transcribing into messenger RNA, and then we're translating to amino acids, which are strung together to make proteins. And so this is a decoder. Sorry, this is an encoder. I'm very sorry. This is an encoder. And the ribosome over here is a decoder. And it's highly analogous to this. So A is 10001 and B is 100010. And you can make a whole table in the ASCII code of what that is. And here, GGG makes glycine, and AAA makes lysine, and there's another table for this too. And so, like, these are both physical processes. I mean, in a computer processor, there are electric fields or electromagnetic switches or transistors switching off, and so there is a physical process going here, and there is a physical process going here. They're both physical processes, but it's very significant that we understand as abstractly and symbolically being a code. And the reason in genetics we say the reason it's a code and it's not just materials is AAA is not lysine and GGG is not glycine. In fact, the AAA never makes it into the string of amino acids. It's just a set of instructions, right? And of course, we know in genetics that if you swap one set of DNA for another and you replace it with some other code, then it'll just run a different set of instructions. And it doesn't care where the molecules came from. As long as they're there and they're the right order, it's going to happen. And so the genetic code is just as much a code as anything that happens in your computer or a barcode or a zip code or anything.
Something to really drive home here is there's nothing spooky about this. There's no ghost in the machine. Like you said, everything is a physical process. This is true in your computer. This is true in the genome. What's happened here is that there is a set of rules that have been set up in advance so that the communication system works. If you don't have those rules set up in advance, the communication system's not going to work. That's what's giving this kind of illusion of this spooky ghost in the machine. It's these rules that exist, and that's what's making the genetic code a legitimate code. It has rules. We've actually been able to figure out what those rules are. You can look at them. They're in a chart. We can hack cells by inserting different messages in the genome, and those cells will make the proteins that we want them to make, that we tell them to make. This is definitely a code.
Well, I'll just address. I've had a lot of people kind of push back on this. I'll just add a little layer of detail. So, in engineering, there is this thing called the OSI 7-layer model, and it's the idea of codes within codes within codes. And this actually goes to where we're going to go next in a little bit, very nicely. All right. And so in the 7-layer model, it's kind of like this, and 7 is kind of an arbitrary number. There could be 10 or 20, but layer 0 is the physical substance. Okay, and in this case, it's the actual DNA strand. It's the fact that these bases are what they are. Okay.
Is that going to include the DNA strand and the ribosome?
No, this is just the code itself. We're not
Okay.
We're not really thinking about the machinery. We're only looking at the code. Okay.
Okay.
So, and in a computer, it's the Ethernet cable. It's the wire. It's a copper wire, or it's fiber optic, or it's Wi-Fi. Okay.
Yeah.
So, right, physical layer. Okay. Layer 1 in computers is 1 or 0. So is there a pulse of light or not a pulse of light on the fiber optic cable? Or is there 5 volts or 0 volts on the wire? Okay, so in electricity, it's volts, okay? And in genetics, it's the ACGT. Okay, so it's a 1 or a 0. So in other words, this is at the level where computers are binary and biology is quaternary.
Right.
Because biology has 4 symbols, right? Mm-hmm. And then level 2 is where we're grouping these in groups of 3.
Right. For codons.
In genetics. So this is the bases, and this is the codons. Okay, so the basic genetic code stuff that everybody's heard about is these 3 layers. So layer 0, 1, and 2 is what engineers would say. Okay. Over on the engineering side, it would be like ASCII, or like, you know how this doesn't happen anymore, but you used to paste stuff from Microsoft Word into an email and it would give you all this garbage.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I remember.
It was because this level, your email program didn't have the right stuff to deal with this level, and then you'd have these garbage characters, right? Well, so then like there's 3, 4, 5 in engineering, like the 5, 6, 7, and number 7 would be like Microsoft Word.
Okay.
Okay, and so if I send you an email, I'm typing stuff up here. And a message gets wrapped in a message and 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 a message. And then it goes through a wire and it comes into your computer, and then you decode it the exact opposite direction. This is one of the most important concepts in computers. And the same thing roughly is going on in higher levels of, so when you jump from codons to proteins, you just went from here to here.
Okay.
Or when you have a whole bunch of proteins and then eventually you're at a chromosome, like now you're like way up here somewhere. And so there's layers of information in all of these systems. There's a tremendous similarity.
That concept, once you get above the codon, that concept gets fuzzy for me. So are you thinking of Microsoft Word? So at the top of your pyramid here, would that be like an organism?
Yeah.
Would that be a cell?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like this would be a whole cell, right? And of course there might be 30 layers, not 7, but
Right.
But at some level you have the whole entire organism, and then you have these subparts. So it's also like language. Like we have physical piece of paper, and then we have letters, and then we have words, and then we have grammar.
Yeah.
And so people deal with this stuff every day. They just don't. So we could say, this is the deeper, this is the symbolism of Shakespeare or something like that, right? And these are the phrases that he used, and these are the rules of grammar. So people actually deal with this all the time. They just don't usually think of it. They don't usually break it up into these components.
All right. So I did some work with Stuart West on major evolutionary transitions, which is a video I know you've seen. And it seems to me, I'm looking at your chart here, that you could map each one of those transitions on top of here. So he goes from, he sees it from genes to cells to multicelled organisms, and then to like bees and stuff have an extra layer where the actual entire hive acts as a single organism. So I guess if we were to map those on here, there'd be I think that would bring us to 6 or so if you're looking at bees.
There'd be a lot of those.
Yeah.
In fact, we could go to the whole planet and we could be in the Gaia hypothesis and, we'd be like way up in the stratosphere somewhere. Right.
Right.
But this is a very useful way to look at stuff, but because there is a hierarchy to it.
How are you relating that to the other types of communication or the other types of information we were talking about earlier? Okay.
So there's intracellular, there's communication inside the cell, and then there's communication outside the cell. So inside the cell, one thing that organisms do is they'll go read a section of DNA, they'll transcribe something into RNA, and something will happen. And this isn't only in reproduction. This could happen other events that are going on in the cell. In fact, as I understand it, the cell is sort of accessing the hard drive all the time for different reasons. Right. Just like your computer does, right? Like you go to a program you didn't use for 2 days, and then all of a sudden the computer's like, wait a second, and then it's got to wake up and the hard drive starts spinning, and then all of a sudden that program works. Well, same thing happens there. So what that means is that somewhere in these middle layers, something is being accessed. It's sort of like, hey, we need that paragraph. Would you go get that paragraph and bring it over here, because there's something we need to do, right? We need to digest this food or something like that.
Right. Let me clarify a couple of things for people that might be getting lost here when we're talking about genetics. So your genome it's organized into chromosomes, but we can actually kind of ignore that for this conversation. If you think of your genome as just one super long strand of DNA, all along that strand of DNA, there are certain chunks that are between a couple thousand letters long to a couple million letters long that we call genes. And those genes are things that get turned into RNA and read by a ribosome to make a protein. I mean, you've got thousands of them. There's over 20,000 different genes in your genome. But they're not just all constantly being read, all constantly being used. Most of them are actually turned off most of the time. We say they're being used when they're transcribed into RNA. That RNA is then read by the ribosome, and it builds a protein. And of course, this is a huge oversimplification of things, but what you're saying is that this extra level of information above the codon is the information about when things should be turned on and when things should be turned off.
Right, and it could be things like at 6 weeks of the development of the embryo, this thing should start happening. I mean, there's just all kinds of things like that.
Epigenetics is this field that describes a lot of these different processes. And we just call all of them epigenetics, but there's a lot of different ones. And people studying epigenetics know that, and they're studying them individually. But a lot of times when people are trying to learn about epigenetics, it's really confusing because you think it's one process, but it's actually dozens, maybe even hundreds of processes that we barely are beginning to understand. And another thing to point out too is every single cell in your body has the same genome, and my eyeball cells and my tongue cells, exact same genome, but different genes are turned off and different genes are turned on, and that's why the cells create completely different proteins and behave completely differently. So this epigenetic layer of information is extremely important, and it's highly, highly developed in multicelled organisms like ourselves. It's less developed in simpler multicelled organisms like sponges, but it's everywhere. Epigenetics is found in pretty much every cell.
That seems to be operating roughly in these levels here. It's kind of in the middle levels of information. It's like graying out software menus. Like you download the trial software, and there's all these things that you can't do, and then you pay the money and you paste in the code, and then all of a sudden, okay, now you can print, and now you can do all these things, right? And so epigenetics is like the code is all there, but you just shut off certain things. So if I start playing guitar and develop calluses, epigenetic switches will go, hey, hang on to those dead skin cells longer because those calluses are useful. And, it's not entirely clear, but it looks as though in extreme cases that change could be passed on to children. What is the capacity for these temporary epigenetic changes to eventually become hard-coded in the genome? But it seems sensible to propose that they probably eventually can be. My perception of the epigenetics aspect of evolution is it means that real-time adaptation is happening 24/7, 365 everywhere in the world with pretty much every organism. This is why organisms are so finely tuned to their environment, because these feedback loops are constantly, okay, adjust, 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 adjust.
This would be a Lamarckian type evolution where experiences that you encounter end up modifying the phenotype of your children. And we do know that it can happen, but we're not sure if epigenetic traits can ever actually cause a lasting evolutionary change. And if so, we haven't honed in on the mechanism yet. So that's still unclear.
Yeah, and this question is like right at the bleeding edge of biology right now. Like, I'm sure 20 years from now we'll have a bunch of definitive answers about this, but right now this is literally where the edge is. I mean, if a grad student wanted to go chase something down, this would be a great subject to chase down, because I don't even get the impression that there's enough people working on this. I mean, a year or two ago, I was emailing a bunch of people, like, guys that write 200-page epigenetics textbooks, and they're like, we don't really know. So it's fascinating. If I was to cast my vote, I would vote for we're going to find a way that these changes become permanent. It certainly would be advantageous.
The two camps here would be that epigenetic changes that are passed on to children are simply an adaptation, so that child will be more in tuned to the parent's phenotype, but it's a temporary adaptation. And so that'd be one camp, and the other camp is that this is actually a mechanism for lasting evolution. And so those are both. It kind of seems right now that it could go either way.
I agree.
So now let's talk about intercellular or even interorganism communication and information that exists in biology.
Well, so it's still code. One of my favorite TED Talks is by Bonnie Bassler, and it's called How Bacteria Talk. And she explains how bacteria have signals, and they'll send these little molecules, and the shape of the molecules it's very much like letters in words. I mean, the analogy is unmistakable. And it's like they have words like me and you and us and them. Is there enough of us? And okay, like, John went out in the cold last night and there's a whole bunch of us, so let's attack. And then John wakes up with a sinus infection or something at 2:00 in the morning. And this is because the bacteria are communicating with each other. And this raises there's a whole field called semiotics, and semiotic is like linguistic, basically. And it's a lens that looks through biology as linguistic exchanges between as communication events.
Wait, can you spell that out?
A semiotic, semiotic.
Okay.
It's related to semiosis, which is I don't know the root words, but it's basically linguistics is what it is. And there's whole journals of biosemiotics that you can go find. It's a hot topic.
Right. Stuart West he's written a textbook called Behavioral Ecology. He worked on it. He was one of the authors of it. And in that, he outlines signaling theory. He talks about how these different signals evolve. So we have very distinctive signals that these cells are using. For a lot of people, talking about molecules and bacteria might be a little bit abstract. We can actually pull out and look at animals, because different animals will develop languages between each other. And we're a lot more used to thinking of gestures and words as languages versus molecules. It's really the same thing. It shouldn't confuse people, but when you think of molecules, you think it gets weird. It's not very relatable. So when you're running in a herd, the point of being in a herd is, if there's a predator outside of the herd, you can actually hide inside the herd to not get eaten. So everybody's kind of being a coward and trying to get into the middle of the herd where it's safe. And the entire herd, when there's a full-on attack, if a pride of lions is attacking a herd, the entire herd will start running, and your chances of getting into the herd safely are pretty high. They're higher than trying to run off on your own. But running in a herd is slower than running on your own. So there's this problem here. And so the lions can easily catch up to the herd. It's no problem. All the animals in the herd are kind of tripping over each other a little bit. And, they just run slower than they would at just one lion versus one gazelle, right? And so the gazelles on the outside, they're just panicked, wanting to get it to the inside. And when the lion comes near, because they can't run forward full speed, they will jump vertically upward as high as they can. And what we found is that lions can read this. They're reading this as a signal. That gazelle jumped super high. If I single him out, I'm screwed. He's going to run away from me. He's way too strong. But if they see another one jump and it can't jump very high, they know that's the one I should go for. And so this is a behavior that started out as a panicky behavior from these antelope, or from these gazelles in this case, and has become it's become a cue for the lion. The lion's using his brain. He figures out, okay, if I go after the one that jumps high, I'm screwed. If I go after the one that can't jump very good, I'm probably going to win. And once predators began to realize this, there was now a selective pressure for jumping super high for gazelles. And there's actually, when we study their body, when we study their anatomy, they've actually hurt their ability to run fast because their mechanics have evolved to jump higher than they should normally. So there's been a compromise, and evolution has actually pulled them towards jumping abnormally high simply because it scares lions. It intimidates these lions. This is an example of a cue turning into a signal. So you have what started out as a cue. The lion picked up on this. Oh, that one's healthy. Don't eat that one. And then natural selection picked up on this for the gazelle. If you want to show the lion how healthy you are, you better jump high. And so then evolution started pulling them towards high jump. According to signaling theory, once natural selection starts favoring the cue sender to give a stronger cue, that is officially called a signal. It's a little fuzzy when that exactly starts, because when something first starts to evolve, it's horrible, and it's refined over time. This is how he proposes that languages evolve between bacteria and so on. So all bacteria are excreting waste products. And so if there's a lot of waste products around you, you know there's a lot of bacteria around you. And if it's a lot of the same species, it's going to be the same waste products. And so you can tell if there's a lot of your kin in your neighborhood. That could trigger something to, oh, I should start excreting digestive enzymes because we'll probably be able to all work in harmony to digest this big piece of food in front of us. So that's how he sees the evolution of signaling happening in biology today. They get really complicated. I mean, if you look at how a flower communicates with a bee, it can get really complicated. And then look at how bees communicate with other bees through these dances, and look at how humans communicate through verbal language. It gets extremely complicated. But he proposes that everything emerges through this cue to signal transition.
Well, this is probably a scene where the lion is feasting on the gazelle, and then the camera backs out, and then you cue the PBS announcer to go, and so this endless struggle for survival goes on and on into
right.
the right, and then the credits roll, and but yeah, I don't think we really even know how many signals are going on.
Oh, absolutely, we don't. No.
It's just it's mind-boggling. As a person who straddles because I do business consulting, I feel like I straddle the border between technology and biology, because a business is a niche construction adaptation of how people get fed, right? A business is a living organism. Okay, it's just a population of, right? But they're also interacting with all this technology, and they have computers, and they have cell phones, and everything, and it's all co-evolving, right? And you get like one little technological advantage, and then all of a sudden the company grows 800%. And so I just see all these things as being very parallel. Personally, I think there's so much to be learned from biology. It's just it's beyond my comprehension. It's amazing.
Signaling theory, actually, that Stuart West used, I believe it, I don't know if it started in business or if it started in biology, but it's used in both. I mean, a corporation is signaling to investors in all sorts of different ways, and knowing how that works, once you know that, you can manipulate your investors, so lots of business people are trying to study what signals investors are picking up on so they can manipulate them. And it's an arms race.
That's right. And I'll just mention one other thing. I met this lady who was heavily involved in epigenetics research, and she made this comment. She said, when we were sequencing genomes, we thought that was a lot of data. She goes, now that we're sequencing epigenetics, she's like, gigabytes upon gigabytes upon gigabytes. It's like exponentially more information, because I could have different epigenetics going on in the palms of my hands than I have going on in my tongue.
Right.
So it gets really complicated. But at the end of the day, it's still signals. It's encoder, message, decoder. If you can understand that, you're off to a good start.
The thing I want to drive home is that the genetic code really is a code. It's not like a code. It is literally a code. And people studying the origin of the genetic code understand this. I see a lot of creationists using the existence of the genetic code as an argument for the existence of God. I think that's horribly flawed. You and I should probably do a debate about that sometime, or depending on if our audience would appreciate that.
They might. Well, I'll just add that 10 years ago, I used this as a out and out God of the gaps argument, and I grew uncomfortable with that. I don't like God of the gaps arguments. I think that there's five explanations for where did the genetic code come from. Humans invented it. Aliens did it. It happened randomly and accidentally. It's an undiscovered process or law of physics, or God did it. And I think number 4, undiscovered process or law of physics, that's where you need to go with it. I don't think the aliens explanation is particularly helpful. I don't think the humans time traveled explanation is helpful. I certainly don't think that it happened randomly and accidentally explanation. I don't think that's even science. I would love it if somebody figured out a law of physics or an emergent process that makes codes. I think it would be a huge breakthrough. And again, we're lobbying for that with our prize money. So, but it's definitely a code. There's no question about that.
Where we are the closest in discovering the natural process for this is in the RNA world hypothesis, and that you're getting the evolution of strands of RNA without a code necessary. But there are lots of problems with that still. And I would put my money on that. That's where we end up finding a solution to all this, is through not necessarily the RNA world hypothesis in a strict sense, but through replicating polymers, developing a communication system in the same way that the lion and gazelle have developed a communication system. Any evolving entities could develop a communication system. And I think that that's the origin of the genetic code, is somewhere in there. And trying to pinpoint exactly that process is going to be extremely difficult. But I think that we can discover the principles and hopefully eventually observe a similar communication system developing in the laboratory. That would be the ideal. It's not happened yet. That would be the ideal.
Well, may the best man win. I mean, I'm all for somebody figuring this out. I think it's a really pivotal discovery. I don't think it's trivial at all. It would be a big deal.
Well, Perry, thank you. It was great.
Fun conversation. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure. You have a pretty loyal following, and it's nice to be trusted with your peeps.
I'll have a link to your book, which I didn't like, in the video description, and a link to my review of it. One more thing I'd like to point out to my audience about this conversation is that if you found any of this useful, just to point out that there's this tendency in our culture right now. I don't know if it's like inspired by Donald Trump or what it is, but to completely dismiss someone because they don't share some of your views. But I'm sure everyone who listened to this got some good information from Perry. Perry Marshall disagrees with me on some things that both of us think are very important. But in spite of that, we can still have good conversations and learn from each other and see each other as experts on specific topics. And that is an extremely important thing to be able to do in this world. And it seems like people are not being able to do this as much lately.
I really want to say there are all kinds of people in biology and everywhere else that I vehemently disagree with, but I have learned very important things from most of them.
Right.
Okay, like not even a tiny fraction. In fact, I don't think there's anything more valuable than wading into some multiple groups of people that you have significantly disagreements with and go, first of all, are they right and am I wrong? Like, seriously, could I just be completely wrong about this? That's the starting point. But also, what can I glean? What's good? And, most people have positive intention. They're trying to figure stuff out. A lot of times they're nervous about things. So yeah, little tolerance and grace goes a long way.
Thank you, Perry. This was great.
Thank you, John.